Hello and welcome to the big picture. The Union Cabinet has cleared a proposal yesterday for the auction of spectrum, which is going to be the largest ever in the history of India. The base price for this largest ever auction has been fixed at rupees 5.6 lakh crores, which is expected to be held in the first week of September. The auction methodology has been followed by this government following the controversy and scandal which had marked the 2G allocations during the UPA rule and the Supreme Court directing that natural resources be auctioned. This auction, being not only the largest ever, also provides the telecom companies the widest variety of spectrum ranging from 700 MHz to 2500 MHz. The 700 MHz spectrum is considered as highly efficient, though it is also the most expensive. Today we will look at what this auction means, how it will benefit the telecom companies and also the people at large. We will also see how much revenues the government will be able to generate from these auctions and also what are the possible hitches which may be faced. To discuss this, I have with me B.K. Singhal, former Chairman and Managing Director of VSNL, Rajan S. Matthews, Director General Cellular Operators Association of India. Welcome to both of you. Mr. Rajan, how desperate are the telecom companies for this auction, for this spectrum?
So very clearly, Girish, we always require spectrum. The question is how immediate is the need? Fortunately, we've been past this point at which we had to get and buy back our own spectrum. It was a do or die, must win business continuity issue in most of the previous auctions. I think we are in a situation now when the quantum of spectrum and the supply side is more than adequate for the next several years. Given the demand that we see on the data side picking up over the next several years, we believe that in the next 2 years or so, there will be a definite need for additional spectrum. As it stands now, because of spectrum trading, spectrum sharing, some consolidation in the industry, some M&A, the optimization of the existing spectrum has led to much more of a efficient utilization of the spectrum. So I don't think we have an immediate dire need for bidding to the stratosphere on the spectrum that is being put up. But the amount of spectrum is certainly welcome. The challenge right now is affordability in terms of this quantum of spectrum.
Affordability, yes, that seems to be a major issue now. Mr. Singhal, Mr. Rajan Matthew is talking about a situation where the telecom companies have a spectrum, and this is some kind of a situation where, they're not in a do or die situation like they were in the past. But looking at it from an ordinary consumer point of view, somebody who uses a mobile phone all the time, and all those people who use mobile phones, the kind of problems which we are facing. So why are the telecom companies saying that they don't need spectrum as desperately as they needed earlier?
I think there is a little bit of posturing there, especially because we are suffering from call drops.
Exactly.
Which is
call drops is a huge problem. Sorry to intervene, sir. And every time this is discussed, why the call drops, they say that we don't have enough spectrum.
That's right. So it's a I would say catch-22 or chicken and egg or whatever situation you may like to describe it with, or using some anecdotes. See, the point is, I think what Mr. Matthews says, there is some merit, but then when do we decide that this is the right time? See, the industry has been 2 years back saying, get the 700 MHz spectrum vacated from Doordarshan. Now the government has succeeded in getting the 700 MHz spectrum vacated from Doordarshan.
Right.
Similarly, there are some chunks in the 2100, 1800 band which the government had to get vacated from the defense authorities.
Exactly.
So they have succeeded in getting that spectrum vacated. Now, I don't think the government should be always bowing to or kowtowing what the industry says, what the timing should be, what the pricing should be. You see, it is a transparent e-auction mechanism. It is transparent, and therefore, when the process is transparent, there should not be a worry as to the price is high or price is low. And I have done some I would say, economic study as well. And if you look at it, the cost of spectrum, if you go by the EMI, simple EMI calculation, the 5,66,000 crores, it comes to, at 1%, it comes to some 56,000 crore.
At 10%.
At 1% as EMI for an asset which one is acquiring at for 20 years. And today the size of the sector is something like 300,000 crores. And that sector has been built when the spectrum was purchased at 7,000 crores of revenue. So, we can't just say this is expensive. Well, with time and resource and its utility and it is revenue generating capability with the technological evolution, it all adds up to the value, and this value must be paid. And I'm quite sure with Digital India, smart cities, with so many of government's initiatives, there will be an explosion for demand of data. And we have not even, I would say, gone into some of the, hinterland economic centers which are now crying for speed, data, capacities, etc., etc. So, to say that time is not right, I won't buy that, because 2 years back the same industry was saying, get this done. And it is based on an economic rationale that this is the reserve price. And I am quite sure that it will be purchased by those who understand what it means, what it requires.
No, but Mr. Singhal, the fact of the matter also is that this industry is terribly debt stressed. They have huge debts. And the question being asked is, where will they get the money from when they have such huge debts? And why did they run up such huge debts?
See, I'm sorry, but since I'm kind of on the screen and I think people would be listening, you see, somebody should examine why the debt. Let's take Airtel case. They have debt on the books for buying properties in Africa. Did the government ask them to buy those properties in Africa? So they are showing the debt in their books. Reliance Com has got debts. Somebody should, really kind of look into as to why the debt has got accumulated. And the other classic example is Tata Docomo. Docomo paid $3 billion, invested $3 billion into Tata Docomo. Now they are getting out of this business. Now, where is the question of debt for companies like that? This is kind of reverse FDI which is happening. That they invested, they saw the market. Now, where has that money gone?
Where is that money gone?
Where is the money gone? And
who should say that? Who should be able to tell us where is that money gone?
Precisely. You see, the question is that let's not just say that the magnitude of debt should decide the auction. And if you look at the auction, the terms which have been placed by the government on a pricing and payment, one pays on an average about 25% of the total. Let's say it's sold at base price 5,66,000 crores. It is 25% payment upfront.
Exactly.
Then there is a moratorium for 2 years, and then you pay not really the entire cost. You pay that over 18 years.
Exactly.
So, and 18 years, as I've just mentioned, I've done the calculations. I mean, I could say those numbers, would be over 20 years, and would be the government is giving time, okay, guys, get your act together, and in 2 years, you will have your network up and running. There is a market which is braying for data speeds and data speeds, and therefore, you will start paying when you start earning.
Rajan, would you like to respond to this? Is there some kind of an exaggeration of the problems which the industry is facing?
So Girish, there's an old saying, if you torture data long enough, you can get it to confess anything. And I think Mr. Singhal has just proved that point quite elaborately. So let me also give you some data points. Right now, his own numbers say that you stated that the government is expecting 5.6 lakh crore rupees from the spectrum auction. The income or the revenue stream from our industries today stands at 2.5 lakh crore rupees. This is revenue. So let's just say we have a 25% EBITDA margin, which is a cash flow margin. all right, you can do the math and determine when break-even begins to start happening for this type of spectrum. This is only the incremental spectrum, by the way. So let me also give you another data point. Today, we pay 30 to 35% more in terms of a premium on spectrum vis-a-vis international companies. We pay global standard prices for our network equipment because 90% of our network equipment is imported. Our ARPU, which is the revenue we get per user, vis-a-vis international standards, is $3 versus $75 internationally. Again, please do the math. This issue of the debt and examine the bucks, that's a red herring, a bit of a cheap shot if you ask me. All of our companies are public companies. They're audited. All right, they're subject to SEBI disclosure. And so if there's a question of where the debt is going, please look at the financial statements, do the investigation, and you'll find out there's no magic, there's nothing hidden in these numbers. The point we are making is that there's even ICRIA, by the way, has done a study which shows that, look, this industry, as an industry, there are one or two companies that are doing better than others, but as an industry, there is definitely a financial challenge in terms of buying spectrum at these prices and then saying that we must give it to the consumer at affordable prices.
Okay. We're now joined in by Pavan Duggal. Pavan Duggal is a senior advocate in the Supreme Court, who looks into cyber law issues. Pavan, how do you look at this decision of the government to, it's supposed to be the largest auction ever, and it has this ambitious plan of raising something like 5.5 lakh crores?
Well, I think this entire news comes in as a breath of fresh air from the consumer's perspective, because consumers by and large have been feeling the brunt of all the problem. Well, we've all been hearing the factum that spectrum scarcity is there. We've also been understanding the sovereign needs of the sovereign entities to keep on occupying the spectrum for sovereign purposes. But now that this release has started happening, I think it represents another stage, another milestone in the growth of the Indian telecom sector per se. But right now, this assumes even far more significance given the political, shall I say, priority of this government on specifically transforming India into a knowledge society and economy by the year 2018. Those are the stated objectives of the Digital India program, and you are only going to get them into real operation and implementation if you have the benefit of the spectrum that is going to allow all kinds of these services, electronic governance, electronic commerce, mobile governance related services. The government wants to be at this mobile device for the users. Now that's only going to happen if the spectrum is going to allow the government to provide for these services. In addition, M-commerce is seeing a huge fillip in the country, and those guys require the basic principles and the basic infrastructure of the spectrum allocation per se. So I think it's great news. As far as the valuation is concerned, there's always going to be some, shall I say, disconnect or the other. But it's the sovereign government who has got the sovereign power to decide the timing and the pricing for the spectrum. That's their part of their sovereign function.
And then since it is a auction model, we'll have to wait and watch how it will. Now we are joined in by Professor Rohit Prasad, a professor of economics at the Management Development Institute and an auction expert. Professor Prasad, how do you look at this whole thing? I don't know whether you were there. You heard the Mr. Rajan Matthews talking about the valuation of the whole thing. The concerns being expressed now by the telecom operators about the valuation. How do you look at this? Is this valuation which the TRAI seems to have evolved, is it okay according to you?
Good evening. Thank you for having me on this show. I wanted to make a couple of observations about the valuation. There are two aspects to the valuation of spectrum. One is the intrinsic value of spectrum, which depends on the frequency band in which it is located, the propagation capability, and the ability to support technology. The other is the extrinsic value of spectrum. The extrinsic value of spectrum stems from the ecosystem that exists in order to support devices and technologies in that particular spectrum band. Now, if you look at the spectrum bands which are being auctioned presently, there are good ecosystems in 3G and 4G in the 1800 megahertz band, the 2100 megahertz band, and to some extent in the 2300 megahertz band. However, there is not a very well developed ecosystem in the 700 megahertz band, the 800 megahertz band, and the 2500 megahertz band. Therefore, I believe that the reserve price that the government has come up with, which is based mainly on the intrinsic value of spectrum, is going to create a barrier for the participation in the auction for 700 megahertz, 800 megahertz, and to some extent in the 2300 megahertz bands.
2500.
I also believe that in the 2300 megahertz bands, the recent mergers or acquisitions rather have placed certain operators within the 50% cap on spectrum holding that is in force, as a result of which even the 2300 megahertz band auction may be slightly compromised. The two auctions which I believe will be successful will be the 1800 megahertz band auction and the 2100 megahertz band auctions.
Okay. Mr. Singhal, there is this law, there is this already, people are talking about how this 700 megahertz, which is supposed to be the most efficient, but it's also the most expensive, the kind of valuation which has been made, and also as Professor Rohit Prasad points out, the ecosystem doesn't support the kind of...
You see 700 megahertz band for broadband wireless access.
This is most efficient for the 4G, which...
It is most efficient, and this band is also been used in United States.
Right.
But then immediately there will be a response from others that, well, that doesn't fit into our scheme of things. So to say that there is no ecosystem completely is misplaced. Okay, right? Similarly, 800, I mean, they are also with good propagation and with good characteristics, and there is maybe not completely, but there is a 3G component there which can be used for 800 megahertz as well. And that's why I think Reliance Jio and the others have kind of got that 800 megahertz band purchased so that they can use it. So to say that ecosystem doesn't exist, my question is, why was the industry asking for this band to be released immediately by the government 2 years ago? So again, the question is that we just can't wait the ecosystem to develop. Now the government has demonstrated, guys, here is the spectrum, here are the markets, as Mr. Duggal has also pointed out. We have Digital India, we have smart cities, we have so many initiatives, and then get on with it and get going.
Okay.
So they have taken an initiative to do that. So these reasons must not be, I would say, placed to say, look, this is something wrong. It's not.
Mr. Rajan, how do you respond to that? 700 megahertz, they already talk about it.
So,
but as Mr. Singhal points out, there is a huge market waiting there for utilizing them.
So again, I think the professor nailed it. Mr. Singhal has somehow missed it, because he should realize that what is used in the USA is a different, plan and a different technology than what is used or proposed to be used here in India. It's like saying just because there's beta and VHS, hey, both of them will give you an equal demand for equipment. They're both different standards and they both operate differently. One does not contribute to the demand for the other. So I think we need to be a little careful in terms of how we compare stuff. On the 700, I think the professor made the adequate point that it's the intrinsic value. Please understand how it was determined. It was determined as 4 times 1800, which is the discovered market price in auction for 1800. But when you look at how that 1800 auction price was determined, please understand it was under great duress and stress on the industry. So those factors have changed substantially, economically and otherwise. And also we have to look at the handset ecosystem, because when you get into the 700, there's no use building out a network when the handset prices are not at the point when it become a mass market adoption platform. So I think we need to understand very carefully the dynamics that go into play. We saw the same problem in the rollout of 3G and 4G. It was stymied for a while because consumers couldn't afford these 3G and handsets and 4G handsets. Now that those price points have come up, we see the uptake. Please let me also reiterate that the demand for spectrum will always be there. That's not what we are saying. We are constantly saying, please give it to us at affordable rates. For example, why are we still being charged license fees, spectrum usage charge, which was the old revenue share regime? Now that we are paying upfront, is it not time to do away with this and allow the industry to retain that and invest it in our networks?
Yes, Mr. Singhal.
I think I would go along with Mr. Rajan on the payment in perpetuity related to the gross revenues. Government cannot be using this as a cash machine or an ATM. We have been writing that government should look at principles of cash neutrality. How much do they want to get cash out of the telecom sector? See, 30%, 35% or whatever percentage is being charged. Let them look at the cash neutrality and see, this is the quantum we want out of the industry. And if the industry is doing well and the government is again taxing them by 30%, that's unreasonable. That's point number one. I agree with Mr. Rajan Matthew, and we have written in support of this aspect in various documents. The second thing is about the spectrum usage charge. The spectrum usage charge has got two irritants even today. One is it is not uniform across. The government should do something.
They have not decided on the spectrum usage charges, which...
See, Mr. Nikam, that's the whole problem. You see, now they did some weighted average, etc., complicating things. Let them look at it properly and rationally and say, look guys, all across 3%, but we will show you a glide path as to how we can reduce the spectrum usage charge as you go along, as industry further matures. So those 2 points, well taken. The government must look at it. As a matter of fact, it has referred it back to the regulator, and the regulator should look at two aspects. One is spectrum usage charge and how it can be reduced, and revenue neutrality. It is done in most of the countries outside as well, to say, okay, we don't want to tax you 30% as you go along and perform well. We will reduce it, and this is our quantum. And they can fine-tune it as you go along.
Pavan, is that possible? What is the government looking? Is government taking this sector, as some of the people in the sector say, that as a cash cow, which can be, which as Mr. Singhal says, as an ATM?
Well, I think that's a very interesting observation, and to a large extent, the aggrieved parties would tend to think, the government, that any time it requires cash funds that comes back to this particular sector, milk the cow, go away, let the milk be replenished and come back and milk the cow again. I think we need to look at a more holistic approach. You'll have to quickly now realize that gone are the days where it was just voice. Today, when data is supreme, today when now you're already looking at all kinds of data-rich services being made available, it will be very essential to keep in mind a harmonious balance. We would want this ecosystem to grow. This ecosystem is only going to grow if the spectrum is made available. As Mr. Rajan Matthew says, it is required. There's nobody's case that it's not required. The only issue right now is it the pricing going to be so high enough that the relevant stakeholders may feel that they are actually constrained into a pushing situation where they can't really afford the spectrum. So I think somewhere down the line, some kind of a governmental intervention would be required. Right now it's an auction model. We'll have to wait and watch how things happen. But consumer protection, the overall growth of the ecosystem, and finally, keeping in mind India's foremost position as an IT superpower and as a data economy will have to be taken into consideration by the government as it moves forward.
Professor Prasad, you think that these constraints may make these auctions some kind of a flop, because from what Rajan Matthews is saying, there is a lot of concern in the industry about the kind of pricing which has been done.
Well, let me put my money on the table and say that I believe that the 700 megahertz auction will be a flop. And I wanted to just point out a couple of things, addition to what others and I have been saying. You see, the 700 megahertz intrinsic value rests on its propagation capability. But if you look at metros, where most of the demand for 3G and 4G is expected to come, the base stations are already so close to each other that the propagation capability is really not relevant anymore. Whether it is 700 or 900 or even 1800, they all will do an equally good job given the distance between the base stations that exists today. If I may be allowed to do so, I would also like to place on the table a few other concerns. One is that even today, a lot of the backhaul of traffic in metro areas happens on spectrum rather than on optic fiber. That is, after the data is transmitted from the mobile device to the base station, the further journey is happening through spectrum, and this is likely to become a bottleneck in future. So we do need to enhance our spectrum for backhaul, or we need to build out better optic fiber networks. May I also say that as we grow our data economy, we also need to think about using Wi-Fi to supplement our licensed spectrum, as has been done in the Western countries, where operators are using handoffs, Wi-Fi handoffs, to automatically transmit traffic from licensed networks to the Wi-Fi spectrum in areas of congestion. So to come back to your question, 700 megahertz, unfortunately, I believe is going to be a spectacular failure, and I hope that I'm spectacularly wrong.
Okay. Rajan, very quickly, I don't want you to respond to what Professor Prasad said. We'll wait and watch for that. I don't want you to commit yourself to anything to that. But the fact of the matter is, from a user's point of view, from an ordinary man's point of view, what will this spectrum, this additional spectrum do? Will it give us 4G, better speed? Does it cut across all the operators? How is it going to help?
So clearly, more spectrum is required in order to provide the type of customer experience that's desired. There's not a question about it. The only question is, how do you, manage your acquisition of spectrum to meet the needs that is being developed from the consumer? So that's going forward. And one of the things that is happening right now in technology, the technology is becoming band neutral. That means that 4G is going to work on 700, it's going to work on 800, on 900, on 1800, on 2100, on 2300, on 2500, and nobody is going to be investing in obsolete 2G technology anymore. All of the new investments, when new spectrum is acquired, is going to be either 4G or the upcoming 5G, whatever it is. So this is the way forward, and so the spectrum that's going to be acquired will definitely help enhance customer experience and usage. Not a question.
Okay, and hopefully the call drops will also end, hopefully, and will spare the customer of the torture which he faces regularly. Anyway, thanks to all my guests. We'll wait and watch how this auction will turn out to be.
Thank you.
Mr. Singhal, very quickly, last words.
Very quickly, I think I will also put my neck on the table. This auction is going to be a success.
Okay.
I think it's a scare case.
Okay, on that note, we'll end and we'll wait and watch how the auction will turn out to be. Thanks to all my guests. Please keep watching. We'll come back with another edition of The Big Picture, same time tomorrow.